Well, welcome everyone. 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with the third session of Roots of the Future, a succession planning program for sustainable land stewardship. My name is Veronica Bullock, and I'm an agricultural resource educator for Purdue Extension in Franklin County, and also a part of the Purdue succession planning team. So to get started, we're going to go over a few housekeeping things just as a reminder. If you joined us for sessions 1 and 2, these will be very similar to what you have seen the last 2 weeks. But just some reminders that these presentations will be recorded and sent out to registrants after. So there's going to be some delay while we get these to you, just so we can edit the closed captioning. And we'll also share some further reading material. Please make sure that your microphone is muted during the presentation. And we will take questions in the chat and answer them at the end. And then once we finish, you can also raise your hands afterward and we can call on you and you can unmute yourself. And again, just a reminder, please try not to share any personal stories. And we only ask you to do this so we protect your private personal information. So just make sure you generalize these when you ask questions. A couple caveats we also want to mention. A reminder that these materials are intended to present just general information on succession planning. So hopefully you'll find the information to be applicable, but this isn't going to transfer to every state and territory. And these materials are not meant to provide any legal advice. So any specific advice, you need to reach out to an attorney or another professional that's well-versed in the facts and the circumstances that are related to your specific situation. So making sure that you're reaching out to one of these individuals in a jurisdiction where your property is located. And just a reminder that next Monday at 7 p.m. will be the final session on April 14th, and that's going to cover legal and estate issues. But tonight, our presentation is on family meetings and communication. So like I said, my name is Veronica Bullock. I'm an ag and natural resource educator for Purdue Extension in Franklin County. And with me tonight is Jenna Neese. I'll turn it over to Jenna to introduce herself and start the first part of the presentation. And I just wanted to add to at the beginning here, if there are any basketball fans that are on tonight, we should be done before the game starts. So you should be able to do both if that's important to you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Like Veronica said, I'm Jenna Neese. I'm the A&R educator in Putnam County, so Greencastle, Indiana. And I am a member of the Purdue succession planning team, but I also hold a very unique role as the adult education coordinator for the Putnam County Soil and Water Conservation District. And I'm really excited to talk to you about family meetings and communication. And what I usually like to do when we first start talking about family meetings is to look at this three-circle family business model that was developed by Renato Taglieri and John Davis. And in here, you can kind of see how when you own a business or land or anything with several individuals, there may be different parts interacting in different ways. So if we think about a family that may own a woodlot, you may have some individuals who are just owners and they're members of the family and they're in that little gray area or darkened area. I'm going to see if I can write here with my little annotator. They may come in here if we see that little crazy star. They're both an owner and a family member. But they may not be the ones doing the management because they may be unable to go out there and work in the woods and help remove the Asian bush honeysuckle or any other invasive species that are there. It may be the next generation who aren't owners, but they're family members and they're the ones that manage it. So they're in this overlapping area as part of the family. And then you may have someone, honestly, in your family who doesn't own it, doesn't necessarily want to help manage it, and they're found in this third area. And what we always say when families are talking about succession planning, go ahead and draw your circles like we've got here, but map out where your family is now. Where does different members fall into play? And of course, I forgot to mention some people may fall as part of an owner, the manager, and the family. But then map also where your family may be 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. Because you may see that people may change as things go and they may develop more of an interest and want to be part of the management. Or maybe the owners want to pass
What's
the
our
family
volume?
early. And so just spend some time drawing your 3 circles, figuring out where you are, and adjusting for your individual situation. Clear my drawings here. So once you've done that, of course, the next thing we want to recommend, and you can do this as part of it, but is to have a family meeting. And we always say, do we need to have a family meeting? A lot of people wonder, but of course, we're going to tell you that you do, because family meetings are good. And they're really summed up by this quote that
Let's
the
just
2
start video.
traits most commonly found among healthy families are shared decision making and effective communication. And family meetings help to do both. Because when you have a family meeting, you're going to work on communication and you're going to be able to hopefully make some decisions together on the future
I did a
of
whole
your
lot.
woodland lot.
Does it need to be all
And so,
capital
what
A?
is a family meeting? It is an opportunity
Been
to
here
discuss
before.
important issues. Whether that important issue is succession planning, like we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, or maybe it's another issue such as, do we want to file for EQIP funding, or do we want to try to do a timber harvest? Those can all be things that you can discuss at a family meeting. They're not necessarily tactical meetings or meetings where you're going to say who's doing what task. Yes, there are meetings to where it's important to, make sure everyone understands that, hey, we do need to control the invasive species in the woods. Those are important, but a lot of times those take place as we're getting ready to put our boots in the ground and do some work. And we really don't necessarily want to have them as emergency meetings because something's gone bad, most likely in the case of succession plan that someone's passed away and we have to decide what we're going to do with the land. We want to have these meetings early enough that we don't have the bad happen without decisions already made. Usually, family meetings are focused on important long-term strategic issues such as succession planning as things. And overall, most families underestimate the importance of this type of communication. So why do we have them? Again, you want to have open discussion related to your land. And you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So you want to make sure that whoever may be inheriting the land, or maybe who's on the same generation of those who might be inheriting land, know who's going to get it or if it's going to be divided among them. So that someone doesn't get surprised later on down the road over what decisions were made. You also want to make sure that you use these to help with management records and ensure everything's up to date, and then to keep moving your succession plan forward. Because once you develop a succession plan, we always say it's good to revisit it every few years to make sure that your wishes are still going to be able to occur, because sometimes we get these decisions made and then life happens and who we had thought might be our successor may not want to be or may not be eligible to be a successor any longer. And we hope that doesn't happen, but unfortunately it does happen. So some common pitfalls related to family meetings. Obviously, the very first one is not having the meetings at all, followed by not having them in a timely, regular schedule. So maybe only having one here in 2025 and not having another one until 2027. Probably need to have them more frequent than that. Having a dominant stakeholder, so having one person that does all the talking and never letting anyone else share, because if we have one person taking control and always talking over everyone, then people get their feelings hurt, they don't feel like they have a voice, and they're not part of the family. And Veronica's going to talk later about some communication things so we can hopefully avoid that dominant stakeholder. The same goes with understanding generational differences. So that can be understanding why different generations interact different way, but also understanding that maybe the way one generation sees the land or the woodlot may be different than the other one because they have different feelings or connectedness to the land. Never taking a break from the meeting. So we don't want a meeting to start tomorrow evening and it go 3 days and we're still talking about the same issue. We need time to be a family, and we don't need every time we're together as a family to be focusing on this succession plan. We want to have breaks and still be able to understand how we would all interact as a family and give some breathing room so that we can think, clear our heads, and come back to the drawing room when it's time to have that next family meeting. And of course, remembering our nonverbals. And I know Veronica will probably talk a little bit about it, but nonverbals can be very dangerous. And so if we're using nonverbals and not realizing it, can really hurt a family meeting. So we want to make sure we keep our nonverbal communications in check. So making sure we're not rolling our eyes, that we're paying attention, when we're listening to people, and that we're not being distracted by other things that are making people feel like we're not listening to them. So then one of the things that always comes about these farm or these family meetings is thinking about who has the power to make decisions. And so you'll hear Veronica and I throughout the time referring to incumbents or successors. So our incumbent would be the owners of the woodlot, those who have the financial power or most likely in control. And of course, they are definitely some of the decision makers. And typically, we would think that these would be the individuals who would initiate succession discussions, realizing that they cannot own the land forever, and that at some point they have to make a decision on what's going to happen to the land after they're not able to take care of it or after they have passed away. And so hopefully they're able to see that there is something that needs to be done so we can be prepared for when that time happens. Our successor typically is someone who may be coming forward, going to be the next owners. Sometimes we refer to them as the younger generation. They may not have as much financial power because they don't necessarily own the land yet, but they may be needing to be given some power, whether it's being brought in to let them work with NRCS so they understand how that works if they're going to potentially have some funding or different plans with NRCS. So they're the ones that have to be brought in to those succession planning discussions and trained so they can manage the land to see it through the next generation and hopefully on to the next. We may also have some non-immediate family members who probably won't be making many decisions, but they might be like a second cousin or a third cousin who their grandparents were still part of the land and they may want to occasionally come by and help. They probably aren't going to be making decisions, but they might be someone you might want to talk to, and you never know. Maybe your who you think is a successor doesn't really want to own the land, but maybe the non-immediate family member might still hold the passion to want to be a part of it. And so just having those open and honest discussions and finding out what that successor may want or not want might open your eyes too. So some suggestions again on how to determine who is involved. Like I said, usually our owners and our incumbents are the ones that initiate the succession planning discussion. They should be involved in every aspect, and they definitely get a vote because they hold the asset. Our invested successor, they're the ones that are probably going to be coming on as the next generation to own the land. Again, they should be involved in every aspect. They may not be the one who initiates the succession planning discussion, but I'll be honest, sometimes they have to. Sometimes our owners, our incumbents, don't want to discuss or want to think about the future because they know when they think about the future, they're not necessarily going to be there. And so sometimes we may have to be, as a successor, willing to say, have we thought about this? We want to know your wishes. And so they need to be, maybe have to initiate some of the starts of succession planning. And if there is something that needs to be voted on, they probably should have a vote. We have our less invested successor. So a good example of this would be if my grandmother owns land or owns some forested land, and she has 3 children. My mother, who lives on the land, has helped taking care of the land, is probably going to be the successor. She has 2 siblings. One also lives on the land, but has nothing to do with it. And then my uncle lives 2 hours away and really doesn't come around. He'll come for holidays, but as far as being involved with the land, he's not out here and would be a less invested successor. And so sometimes we have to think about the less invested successor because of the whole idea about fair versus equal. It's very hard. Sometimes we want to treat every one of our children fair. We also want to treat them equal. So in that case, my grandmother has 3 kids. She could choose to be equal, and everyone gets 33.3% of the land. That would be very equal. Or she may choose to be fair and say that since my mother has put in what we call sweat equity, she has helped take care of the land, maybe she should get a little bigger chunk than my aunt and my uncle. And so fair versus equal is a common discussion that we have in succession planning, trying to decide how do we want to handle that moving forward. So when we think about that lesser invested successor, sometimes they may get a vote. Sometimes they may be the quiet person in the back listening. And again, we have that non-immediate family member who may want to still be able to come help on the weekends when they have time, but they know they will never necessarily own it, but they would like to be informed on how things are going to progress with the land and who may inherit it, and can they still interact with them and know when you're doing a large maintenance project so they can come out and get their hands dirty and help work the land that maybe their grandparent did or their great grandparent, so they still have that connected feeling to the family. So I believe this may have been emailed out to you. If not, you'll be getting it. But we have this little how to determine who is involved chart here. And what you would do is you would write in there who is currently in the owner incumbent category. Do they currently get a vote? And then why or why not? And you would do that for your individual situation so you can decide who should you bring to the table for your family meeting. Now, this doesn't take a lot of time, but it is something nice to let you really think who might need to be involved. And you may find out that even just in that invested successor, your invested successor may be your son, the less invested successor may be your daughter-in-law. And obviously you need your son in there, but I would recommend probably the daughter-in-law too, even though she might be less invested. You know, they are married, they're probably going to need to make sure they're on the same page, or else that can lead to some stressful situations. And so we do have that worksheet for you. Like I said, it may have been emailed before. If not, you'll be getting it afterwards. And we hope that you spend some time just filling it out so you can think about who should be involved in moving your woodlot forward in terms of succession planning. So how do we prepare for a family meeting? Begin by inviting the correct group of people. And so, like I said, we have that worksheet that will help you decide who should be there. Next, you need to set your ground rules so that everyone knows what to expect and what behavior you expect from them. And we'll talk more about some specific ground rules in a minute, but it's kind of like what Veronica laid out at the start of tonight, saying, you know, this is how we're going to work. Please keep muted. Please put questions in the chat, different things like that. So setting those ground rules or expectations. Then we want to develop an agenda. So what are we going to discuss? And we'll have an example of an agenda later. We always recommend avoid having the meeting at a kitchen table. The kitchen table, the dining room table, those are for your family. So keep that as a family spot. Don't make it so that someone doesn't want to go there and have a discussion. If you have any other places that you can meet, maybe you have a barn that has a table that you can set up, meet there. But try to keep that house protected for family, not for some heated discussions that may develop as you're working on your succession planning. Make sure to allow each person a chance to share their opinion and be respectful of each other's time. So that goes back to developing those ground rules in your agenda so that you give everyone a chance to talk. And at the same time, we don't have that person who is being the dominant one that lets no one else talk. And that we know, okay, we only have an hour for the meeting. We're not going to let it drag on to an hour and a half because someone in the family probably has something planned and can't give up that extra half hour. And then make some decisions ahead of time on how you're going to make decisions and how you're going to talk them through. So knowing who gets that vote, does it have to be everyone has to come to the same conclusion, or is it majority rule? Simple as that. So some ground rules for having an effective family meeting. Remember to take turns speaking. And right now it's been a lot of me speaking, but in a few minutes it's going to be Veronica's turn. So we're going to take turns speaking. Make sure you're listening to each other. You're respecting everyone's opinions and your ideas. So putting on our listening ears is what we say to kids when we're doing classes. Making sure we're giving good eye contact. Making sure that you're not getting very critical of a person on what they're saying or critical at the messenger, that you're listening to it. And when you don't understand, don't get mad. Just say, I'm having a hard time understanding you. Can you repeat that? Or maybe we can talk through it differently so I understand. So trying to make sure that you're being polite and respectful to everyone's ideas and opinions. Rotate who's leading the meeting. Maybe that first one, it needs to be that incumbent leading the meeting. Maybe the next time it should be the successor, and you can switch back and forth. Or if there's multiple successors, so maybe you have two kids taking it over, letting each one of them having a chance to lead the meeting. Now make sure everyone comes to the meeting prepared. If you know there's certain topics that are going to be discussed, make sure they understand them. Of course, avoid side conversation and comments. So we don't want to hear talking and whispering off to the back because that's no fun. That leads people to feeling like they're being talked about or hurt. I would also say it doesn't even have to be the whispers to the side. It could also be text messages back. Those aren't fun either. Maybe put the cell phone to the side and not have them in front of anyone so no one's distracted by it, but they're also not using it as a way to have side conversations. Of course, be honest, respectful, provide your agenda a few days in advance. Don't interrupt, and don't just assume that silence is agreement. So we've all probably been in meetings or discussions with people where you didn't know exactly what to say, so you just smiled and kind of nodded a little bit as you were listening, and you never truly shared what your opinion was. And maybe you really didn't agree with them on what was getting said, but because you didn't speak up and say, I'm not really sure of it, the person who said it just automatically assumes you agreed with them. So make sure that everyone understands silence does not mean agreement. Or maybe you do feel like silence is agreement. Make sure you have clear decisions on that. Again, having a good start and end time. If the meeting's only going to be an hour, end in an hour. Stay on topic. Don't go off in tangents. We know we probably all have stories on how we were involved in the woodlot, how we wanted to see it flourish, and different ideas and things, and that's great. But make sure you get what is required of a meeting done before you really get off topic. have someone take down meeting notes or plan or say who's going to follow up on what. Because as you'll find out in a few minutes, there may be times when you need to have some extra people join the meetings to help you progress. Ensure that everyone's participating. So again, if we start having that silence moment, you might stop if you notice that Veronica's not talking and be like, Veronica, do you have something you'd like to share? So we make sure she has a chance to voice her opinion. And again, agree on a process to make important decisions. Is it majority rule? Does everyone have to come to agreement and agree on it? How do you want that to be done? So scheduling our meetings, schedule them regularly so they become routine. Maybe they're going to be quarterly. Maybe they're going to be monthly. They may be more frequent at the beginning, and then you can stretch them out a little bit longer to only being 2 times a year once you feel like you have everything in place. Resist the temptation to postpone them, because once you start postponing them, unless it's for an emergency, you're probably not going to get back on that schedule. So if there is an emergency that happens and you have to postpone them, it's okay. But make sure you put a date in your calendar that says, okay, on this date, we're going to get back to this. We're not going to completely forget about it and keep postponing it. Because if we do that, it doesn't help us at all. And make sure these become a habit, because the more you do them, the better off you are. So here is an example agenda where it's going to be called to order by the facilitator or the successor or the incumbent, whoever is going to lead the meeting. In this case, they had a year-end financial discussions. That may not apply to every situation. Maybe they're going to talk about their equip application. Talk about winter management plan. So who's going to be in charge of it? Have they done an estimated expense of what their plans are? Talking about their succession steps. So who's going to be on their advisory team? Who's going to initiate contact with their advisory team members and establish some goals for meeting with their advisory team? And then next meeting, when is it? Who's going to lead it? Having that in written up and letting everyone have that gives them a place to take notes. It makes sure that you know what your discussion is. And of course, this is just our January one. There may be one for February, or maybe you're doing it quarterly, so the next one would be April. Oh, and make sure you don't forget to put adjourn, because no one wants to stay in a meeting forever. So who might be on your advisory team? The main ones that you would want would be an attorney, someone that is experienced in succession planning, land transitions, and estate and gift taxes is really important. I will say that the succession planning team does have some attorneys, attorney lists, so we can provide that. There's not necessarily attorneys in every county, but we do have some that we have worked with as part of our team, doing other programs. And so we are aware of their ability, but we're not necessarily recommending them. We're just telling you that they're available. You would want your accountant there. Again, someone that's familiar with taxes, someone that might be familiar with business structure if you have to have a business structure, and someone that is familiar with succession planning. Some maybes, depending on what you're thinking about. It might be your insurance agent. Again, they might help you when it comes to estate and gift taxes. Maybe your financial advisor. Again, help you with some of the tax issues and different things like that. A business consultant, if you're worried about risk as part of your succession planning. A consulting forester, because they can kind of give you some expertise directly related to the management of your forests, and some best management practices that you might want to implement. If you're having some struggles with the meetings, then you may need a meeting facilitator or a mediator who can come in and help with the conflict side of things. And in some cases, extension educators can be sounding boards that can maybe get you started and help just give you guys a chance to talk things through with someone that's listening and taking notes that might say, okay, this is an issue for your attorney. Nope, this is an issue for your accountant. So those are some ideas of individuals who you may want to include in your advisory team. Now, we've talked about your family meetings a lot. and then also on your advisory team some. Now we really need to talk some more on communication so that we make sure we have our great skills ready so that those meetings go smoothly. And I will turn it over to Veronica for this discussion.
Thank you, Jenna, and for sharing all these great tips about family. So if you're wondering like why we're spending all this time talking about family communication, it's because family communication is so important. It determines relationships with each other and sets the tone for the family living in the family's land. And it's important because it's not really simple. So communication is more than what you say and do. Your message depends on how you think, how the other person will react. And it's important to remember that some people may communicate differently. So each person has several different family communication patterns that develop over time. And depending on who is being communicated with, the setting, the timing, and other factors, it's important to try to recognize those patterns, especially during tough time and tough conversations. And this is going to help build awareness in how you can become a better communicator in the future. So we want to make sure that we're taking the time to think about and understand those different perspectives. So we all have something that we want to share and communicate with another family member. And usually using words is the most common way that we express our thoughts and feelings. But as Jenna mentioned earlier, a lot of times we send these non-verbal messages as well. So whether that's with your eyes or your facial expressions, your body movements, you want to make sure that you're being aware of that non-verbal communication. So I'm going to ask a question in the chat if you don't mind responding. So have you ever known anyone in the family to stomp out of a room without saying a word after a conversation? You can just answer as a yes or no in the chat. And if we see someone stomping out of the room after a conversation, that's a sign of a nonverbal message. So if we're having some of these conversations, and we see people putting, they haven't seen that yet, that's great. That your conversations are ending in a kind of a hostile way, but you just want to make sure that you're not sending these negative nonverbal cues. So sometimes this could be because people are afraid they're going to lose control, or maybe they're reluctant to change, or sometimes it's because of these generational differences as well. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these communication skills and what you can do to hopefully avoid a negative interaction if you've had one in the past, and think about how we can improve. So really taking some time to focus on the positive and focus on what's best. So you want to try to gain understanding of those different personality traits and perspectives. And you want to understand a little bit about communication theory. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but that's really thinking about how something is communicated is more important than what's being said. So again, thinking about those nonverbals and making sure that you can develop those listening skills. So we're going to talk a little bit about effective listening and what that means, and trying to remove some roadblocks for communication. So you want to try to avoid using the you word when you're talking about blame, and focus more on using I statements. So really listening, focusing on yourself, I and we statements rather than you, and pointing accusations. And that's going to help kind of prevent some of these roadblocks. And again, it's just important to remember that communication is something that we're working at all of the time. So how you say it counts more than what you say. So I think this is pretty amazing to kind of think about when people say something, what they say. We only usually remember about 7% of those words, or that's the only part that's kind of important when we're thinking about that. 38% counts toward the tone of voice, so how you say it. So maybe if I'm talking excited about something, and I'm really excited about taking over a part of the forest or the woodlot, I really am invested in that land, I'm going to be excited. If it's something maybe I'm not super passionate about it, I'm not as invested or don't care, that tone of voice is going to come across. And then 55%, which is really important, is that body language, which is leading up to that total message. So again, how you're presenting yourself and making sure that you're vested as a listener. So being interested And the way that you present too is gonna kind of tell if that listener is ready to hear that message or not. So that delivery and that active listening are gonna be really important as a part of this communication factor. So how do we actually become an effective listener? And really, this is probably one of the most important parts of communication. So good listeners, they send nonverbal messages of care and concern, even if he or she does not agree with the message that's being sent. And I think that that's a really important part of this, is you don't have to necessarily agree with the message to be an active listener. So you always want to show that respect to the speaker. And it's also important to know to be kind of a passive listener too. And what we mean by that is maybe it's something that it's not really worth investing in for the communication. Maybe it's something you just need to let go. Versus if you're an active listener and you're actively engaged in the conversation, something you can do to make sure you understand. Jenna mentioned this a little earlier, is kind of paraphrase to make sure you're understanding what the speaker is saying. So you could repeat something if you're talking about your forest land and the successor is really interested in taking over in the future. They could talk to the current owner and say, well, what I hear you say about what you want the future to look like is this, and kind of confirm that what you're saying and what the other person is saying align, so that you can kind of reach a consensus or agreement. And you can kind of express understandings for a speaker's feelings that way too, when you paraphrase and repeat what they're saying. And it's also important too to ask questions, especially clarifying questions like, did I understand you correctly? Or could you explain this a little bit more so I can better understand what your point is when we're talking about the land? And all of this is really important because thoughtful listening really builds those relationships. So if there are conflicts that happen between family members where they don't agree, we spent a lot of time last session talking about conflict. And we know that that's normal. Like, it's normal for people to have conflict, but making sure that we're taking the time to listen effectively and treat those others with respect. And it's important to remember too, with these communication expectations, that things can vary between generations. So we have a couple examples on the slide here of what different generations may expect when it comes to communication. So for example, traditionalists and boomers, they prefer that verbal communication when we're talking about policy and procedures. First, if you were talking to a younger generation, like a Gen Xer or millennials, a lot of times they prefer to receive policy or procedure changes electronically, so they can keep a record of it that way. I found this last point really interesting though, when it comes to like career impact and discussions with managers, really all generations prefer that in-person communication. So if we're taking that and applying it to our family business or our land and talking about how we want to pass that on, it's really important to make sure you're carving away the time, like Jenna said, to set these family meetings and have these in-person conversations, because regardless of what generation you are, this in-person communication is really important. So you want to think about the typical interactions within your family member and your own land operation for this. So if you have multiple generations, it's intergenerational that are working together, you want to make sure that you kind of think about some of these generational differences too. And you want to review times and things that are gonna go well to help solve your problems. So it can be easy to think of other family members and some of the conflicts that may come out. But you want to make sure that you take a moment too to look like seriously at yourself and see what kind of communication style you have and what patterns you're noticing within yourself. Because at the end of the day, we have the most control over ourselves for changing our family interactions. So kind of setting the tone, if you've been equipped with some of these tools, and we're going to talk a little bit about some best practices too, but keeping those in mind and how you can kind of help set the stage in your family meetings with your ground rules, with your own communications. All right, and with that, we're going to move on and talking a little bit more about avoiding this generational conflict. In some ways, you can kind of move through this. So we won't go into conflict deeply since we spent so much time on that last week, but just want to reiterate a couple of things. So you kind of want to recognize the stage of where you are within your succession plan. And again, remember that there are differences in those personalities. So it can be tough to bring up some of these issues that may cause conflict. So one of the things that we recommend is trying to bring up these tough issues softly. And what that means is, again, thinking about our nonverbal cues and our communication style and tone, coming at some of these things gently, so it doesn't come across as aggressive to people. And that's just to make sure that we're being respectful, even during conflict. And remembering back from our presentation last week, being willing to compromise as well. And if you're getting to a point where there is a lot of conflict between generations or between people in your family, another thing you can do is suggest a timeout or kind of a cool down. Like maybe you're in a family meeting and this is something we need to table to our next meeting, or we need to table to a later time so we can all kind of think about it and cool down. But it just makes sure that you want to avoid assumptions. So making sure you're covering those things in your communication, not generalizing what you think they may or may not think. And most importantly, making sure we're communicating often. So as Jenna said, maybe you don't want to wait multiple years to have these conversations, depending on your family and where you are in your succession plan and how you want your forest land to progress in the future, making sure that you're having these conversations. And I wanted to use this photo in the background that kind of shows some different stages of the forest to kind of help put this into perspective and visualize some of this. Like maybe you're a young oak, like that's in the beginning of your succession plan, and you're needing some time to grow and to build up these relationships and things with your family. Maybe you have different ideas, but taking the time to communicate is going to help make sure that you're all on the same page while you're working through these stages of succession. So next we're going to cover some best practices. So if you're thinking about planning a family meeting and you want to have some conversations with your family, what are some things you can do to make sure that you're communicating in a way that's going to be effective and to move the conversation forward? So kind of a best place to start is to agree on rules for difficult discussions. So again, back to those ground rules and thinking about how you want to communicate. So do we want to be texting each other or emailing? Maybe you do phone calls. Are you going to be communicating in person? Making sure that you're having that conversation just so you're not making an assumption and you all understand how you're going to be communicating with each other. Along with that goes with agreeing on response time. So what we mean by that is, are you expecting an immediate response if I send you a text, like within 5 to 10 minutes? Are you okay with it being a few hours? Or do I just need to get back to you by the next day or the next week? And just making sure that people are all on the same page. That way no one is frustrated or gets disappointed by what they think is a lack of communication if you didn't realize it required an immediate response. Also, if you're going to have any agreements that deal with your land or property, you want to make sure that you have those in writing. So if you have a hunting lease on your land or you have some other sort of lease terms, making sure those are in writing. That way, if someone else is working on the property or they need to know what that is, that's in writing and they can easily pick that up and without having to try to guess, especially if something happens to the main owner. So we talk a lot about this in succession planning is you want to make sure that you have things up to date. That way the next generation won't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure things out. And you want to make sure that you put important discussions into a written format for both parties. So just making sure that if it's something that's going to take some time at a family meeting that you're going to be devoting to, like Jenna said, it's best practice to make sure you send an agenda out in advance, but just making sure that you're writing down some of these things that are really important. That way you make sure that they don't get missed or overlooked. So moving on with a few more best practices, you want to make sure, as I've said a few times now, just to make sure that you're using that polite and respectful language. You can also like share your everyday happenings. If your family, especially that you're working with, you want to make sure that you show the other person that you care. So showing some of that fondness or admiration. And you can do this by making sure that you're listening to their concerns and then giving them feedback without interrupting. So part of that active listening is making sure you're taking the time to fully hear the person that's speaking to you before you respond and not the whole time being thinking about what you're going to say next. That's not active listening. So making sure that we're taking the time to fully listen and then respond. And then it's also important too to have these regular check-in and visits. So this could help address any ongoing issues and concerns and making sure that things aren't just lingering and festering. Also, best practice to make sure that you're clearly explaining your expectations. So if a concern does arise, it's good to provide a clear and prompt response. And another kind of best practice, it's not on the slide, but just making sure that your messages are short during disagreement. So this kind of goes back to that clear expectations or providing a clear and prompt response. If there is something you disagree on, make sure that that's clear to the person. That way they can take some time to try to digest and understand that. If you have a whole long story that goes along with why you're upset, they may get lost in the sense of the story. So making sure that you're being clear and concise, sharing that. And then going back to conflict, it's just so important to remember to be respectful even during that conflict. So you want to make sure that you're approaching conflict with a level head. You're focusing on the resolution rather than the blame. So again, not saying, I think this is a problem because you did this, or this is your fault. Using those I or we statements, like, I think we could have improved this situation if we would have done this. It's kind of a way to approach things a little bit more level-headed versus like pointing fingers and those accusations. Because our overall goal is we want to aim for a solution that's going to work for both parties. We want to try to find that compromise or that consensus. And if you are in a conflict, it's important to remember, like we've mentioned with the nonverbal, to calm your body in times of conflict. So a lot of you said you haven't seen anyone stomping out of the room yet. So that's great when you're talking about the woods. Hopefully you've had these great conversations, but if it does get to a point where you see that happening, just remember to calm your body in times of conflict, and then just take that time to focus on the family and then that continual focus on the land. So you want to honor everyone's hopes and dreams with this. And the last thing I want to leave you with before we kind of go on to some of these conversation starters is that communication with family members involves talking, but that listening is so important. So effective listening is really one of the best ways to show you care for the other person. That's going to help build trust, but it does take patience and hard work. So this type of listening is more than just hearing the words that are spoken, but making sure that you're understanding what's actually being said. And I don't think we can say how important that is really with succession planning. So the next thing that Jen and I are going to do is talk about some different conversation starters that you can use to kind of help with this process.
So these conversation starters, we've kind of got them grouped as examples that help with a certain area, but ultimately they should all lead to that succession planning discussion. And so our first conversation starter deals with building trust and rapport. And so we've got examples of what maybe the younger generation or our successor may say versus what the older generation or our incumbent may say. So in the case of building trust and rapport, it may be something where the younger generation might say, will you give me the full history of the land? How did we get here? How has it been kept together, or how has it changed? And that may start that discussion about what's happened and how did we get here, so how can we continue to build on it? Or maybe for the older generation, it may be taking the time to ask what the first memory the younger generation has out on the land. And asking, what do you want the land to look like for your children, to get the idea of whether the younger generation even wants to be a part of it. Of course, we want to make sure you keep in mind that when you build trust and rapport, there are some other things you can do too, such as having hard work, being generously or genuinely curious, being respectful of each other's time, offering help when possible, just learning about the land and the terminology that goes into managing it, respecting each other's values, and being very authentic can help you build trust and rapport. And since we're all family, we should usually trust each other, I would think.
The next conversation starter we have is for demonstrating concern. So what we mean by this, we have a couple examples here. So if you're the younger generation, maybe you're asking about retirement. So I want to make sure that you're able to enjoy the land throughout retirement. What would that look like for you? So demonstrating how you're invested in what the older generation cares about with the land moving into the future. And then if you're the older generation, kind of looking at it from their perspective, maybe you realize it takes a lot of time to manage the land. You've been doing this for a long time, and you know how much sweat equity and how much hard work you put into maintaining the property. And this younger generation coming in, maybe they have a full-time job outside and they haven't been on the land as much. And you want to know, how do you plan on balancing your time between the land and your personal and professional commitments? And this is just a way of kind of demonstrating that concern. And again, even if you don't agree with the response that either of you say, it's just to make sure that you're actively listening again and just trying to understand. So maybe you have a different thought of what their enjoyment of the forestry retirement would look like. It's still important to make sure you're taking the time to understand. And then if you need to ask questions, those clarifying questions to make sure you understand the correct message or the intended message, make sure you're doing that during this time as well.
In terms of paraphrasing, we've given a few examples throughout the evening, but it may be a case where the younger generation may hear of some goals that the older generation or the incumbent have, and they follow up with saying, you know, I understand your goal is that the land is kept in the family for multiple generations. What tools do you have in place to help reach that goal? So have they started the succession planning? This is a big one to be able to kind of chime in and ask. Or finding out that maybe they haven't started it and we need to start working on it. For the older generation, they may say, I hear you say you want to be more involved in managing the land. What steps do you plan to achieve this goal? So it could be as simple as the younger generation saying, hey, I can't come Monday through Friday to work and to help take care of that invasive species that are out there, but I can come on the weekends. Can we arrange a time for me to get involved on the weekends? So just paraphrasing what they may say and bringing it back to ask those clarifying questions like Veronica's been saying, so everyone's on the same page.
So next, verbal affirmation. So with this, it's really important to remember that compliments can go a long way and really help the other person feel valued. So try giving compliments, showing appreciation, and talking over pleasant things that maybe have happened during the day or that connect you both to your property and that land. So if you're the younger generation, you could say something along the lines of, you appreciate all the sacrifices that you've made to keep the land, and I appreciate all the opportunities that you've given me. That can really go a long way to show some respect to the older generation and that you really value the property that you have there. If you're the older generation, you can kind of reciprocate this in a way of saying, I really appreciate you coming back to help manage the land and all the new ideas you've brought with you. So just taking that time to acknowledge the fact and compliment the other person is a really great conversation starter as well, especially if you may be approaching a difficult conversation. Again, kind of framing and setting the stage to get those conversations started.
And open-ended questions are really valuable in communication. So if you're not familiar with the difference of an open-ended or a closed-ended question, a good example is if I ask my daughter, did you have a good day at school? The answer is going to be yes or no. Those are closed-ended. I get no response. An open-ended question is not a yes or no question. It's one where they have to give you more details. And so open-ended questions really help get more information and really start a dialogue to be formed. And so a good example, whether it's the younger generation or an older generation, is you can say, what are your long-term goals for the land? That's a way that you can find out what each other's thinking and see if your goals are the same or if they're completely different. And start that basis of communication where you can start discussing it further.
It's also important too to make sure that you have specific questions in mind. So direct questions that are clear and pointed can be helpful as conversation starters as well, especially if you may be facing a big problem of some sort, or you're concerned with the succession planning process, if you're the younger generation, you could ask, what are your concerns with the succession planning process? If you're the older generation, an example of a specific question would be, what are your financial needs from the land? And I think that these specific type questions or conversation starters can be really helpful if you're facing a big problem that may seem overwhelming at the time. So it can be easier if you break it down into parts and ask some of these specific questions. Again, remembering it's important to keep your emotions under control and to try to have that effective communication, even when another person is angry. So if you can stop and clearly define one part of the problem and ask a specific question about that, that can help you kind of move forward through that problem solving process.
And then disclosing similar situations allows you to make sure that you both understand where you're coming from and that you appreciate the land and want to see it move further. And so here are some really kind of vague examples as to how you might disclose a similar situation to start that discussion. In case of the younger generation, it may be something along the lines of, I remember walking in the forest with Grandpa and it brought me so much joy. I'm grateful you are able to do that with my kids. And then you can lead on to more discussions about walking in the forest and learning more about it. In the older generation, it may be when we were just starting to manage the forest, we borrowed equipment until we could buy our own. In some cases, that younger generation may not know that you had to borrow equipment or that you had to seek advice from individuals. And so once you start that discussion, that younger generation is going to learn more about your forest and lands and how you managed it so that they can hopefully take over and continue to operate the forest and pass it on to future generations. So in summary, we've talked a lot about family meetings and about communications and provided you with several different examples on how to get started and move forward on your succession planning. Remember that communication is difficult and extremely important when you're thinking about succession planning. Understanding those differences among family generations can be helpful in an intergenerational family business or just even in owning anything together with your family, because we want to stay together as a family unit, so we have to be respectful and understand the differences between us all. Remember to consider how you might implement the conversation starters to develop your communication, to start your succession plan. These are just examples of conversation starters. Definitely edit them to fit your needs, but those were some that Veronica and I come up with. And then remember that family meetings can be a way to move your succession planning forward because you bring everyone to the table, everyone gets a voice, and we hope that everyone stays there and doesn't walk off like Veronica was saying. We want smooth communications. We don't want frustrations. So with that, we do want to thank everyone for joining us. Veronica's and mine's contact information is included on here. We also have some resources. Like I said before, you'll have some worksheets if you did not receive them from us. But I'm going to stop sharing. That way I can see the questions and we'll answer questions as you guys have them. So please put questions in the chat for us.
So the first one I see, John, I think, was referring to the stages slide we had. He asked who would be the poison ivy in this situation. And answering that without getting too philosophical, I think it's important to remember that within the family, everyone has a different role. So maybe you have someone that you could say is the poison ivy that may be causing some issues or they're a little bit irritating. But it's important to remember that that person still is a part of the family, but not everyone has to be treated equally. So just kind of going back to some of those like general tips on effective succession planning. And this is kind of going into the next question too. Dick asked, at what age should the landowner start these meetings? You really want to start early, like the earlier, the better. Just having these conversations, and you want to make sure that you're involving the family in these land succession planning discussions. Along with that, you want to be realistic. So look at your family realistically and plan accordingly. So if you have that poison ivy or that's someone that is a little bit difficult, making sure you're being realistic about that. And that's okay. This is your property that you're wanting to pass on. And you want to make sure that you do what's best for that too. And along with that, you don't want to make assumptions. So we mentioned that a few times, but it's important to kind of get over this idea that everyone has to have an equal share, because that's not necessarily true when we're talking about succession planning, and making sure you're taking the time to train those successors. So you want to work with them. So starting early again is better, so they can work alongside you and understand what your goals are, and make sure that your goals align if that's important to you. And then, like, most importantly, making sure you're getting that outside help. So Jenna showed the slide with your advisory team of people you could ask. So making sure that you're involving people that can help you too early in these conversations. Jenna, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
The one thing I would add to the what age should landowner be to start these meetings, a lot of times we hear everyone say they started them too late. And you know, it's better to start them when you have a chance before it becomes an urgent issue, because sometimes these do take times to really get organized and get going. I've been around some families who have used Google Docs to be able to share documents, the agendas, to keep track of what work needs done out on their forest land, to keep track of equip that they've applied for and made sure they've got all the everything formalized in there, and when they have their meetings with the district forester and different things like that. I would also add that we've talked about meeting in person, but sometimes that's not even possible. It may be that the family is so spread out that most of the families here, but maybe, like in my example, I said my uncle lives 2 hours away. He could still come back for a meeting if he wanted to. He may leave 4 states away. And so you may have to do some meetings where they're zoomed in or a conference call, and be respectful of that to allow them to be a part of it too, because they've got a voice and they need to be heard too.
Next, there's a question about last week. Liz is the one that's kind of editing those and putting them together. So if it hasn't been sent out yet, then I'm sure she's still working on it, but it will be sent out once it's ready to go.
Anyone is welcome to raise their hand or something if they want to ask a question verbally instead of typing it into the chat. That's fine too at this point.
We just have
So we have a question here of, have any others had trouble getting liability coverage for the woodland recently? I cannot say that I've heard of anyone. If anyone, or Veronica, if you have an answer, or if anyone else has had that experience, you're welcome to type in the chat or unmute.
someone just put the
Okay, Veronica, your mic is going in and out really bad all of a sudden. So it looks like we have a question from Diane. If my family forms an LLC, can that develop into a way to leave our portion to our kids? So yes, an LLC would be a form of business, or business structure is what we commonly refer to them as. You would need to talk to your attorney on how that can work in passing it down. I know with LLCs, it is really important. We've heard it on the farm side. Make sure you take business notes to ensure that you follow suit for that requirements for the LLC. And so you do, I believe you have to have like at least annual business notes and things, but definitely talk to your attorney on how it can be passed down, because it can be utilized. Any other questions? These have been good so far, so keep them coming. We're here to answer them the best we can. Okay, for those forest owners who are fairly new to owning land, how would you suggest to softly start the discussion of succession with children who live 2 hours away? So, softly start the discussion. Ask if they're interested. That's kind of a little rough, a little blunt. Um, but, finding out if they even want to come visit and if they want to develop a connection with the land. But honestly, just finding out what their wishes is the main thing. And it's hard to do when they're 2 hours away, but at least having that discussion is important. All right, so Diane asked a follow-up question. Okay, we are trying to do this without an attorney. Do we need one? Can AI help? So I deal a lot with succession planning and also land leases. Those are kind of my areas within extension that I work in. And in both cases, there are a lot of information out there on the internet. There's a lot of templates out there on the internet. And we always say the same thing when it comes to legal things. They can get you started, but definitely talking for the attorney, having them, even if it's just going through and having them read through it to make sure that you've got yourself covered, it is more important to do that than trust AI, because there can always be something messed up in an algorithm or something that does not work, or it may be applicable in Kansas or Nebraska, but it may not work for Indiana's laws. So I highly recommend getting an attorney to at least do a check through and not solely going for what you're doing based off of internet or AI. Okay, what if you just sell it? How do you approach the money division? So a money division, so say that someone is passing away or they're going to just sell the family land, and they're going to gain all that money. And so the next question is, what do we do with that money? So there are a lot of ways to invest. So that's when you want to bring in your financial advisor or your accountant so they can advise you on how to best put that money, whether it's in a trust, and then once you pass away, the trust splits it between your family members, or whether you just need a simple will or something like that. So it is best to, in that case, as far as how do you split the money up, to involve your accountant in that. Let's see. Ooh, for that person, are you willing to take a risk of doing something wrong and it blowing up to save a few dollars? I'm assuming that is in reference to using the AI, because again, it's just such a risky thing. That talking to an attorney is very valuable. Let's see. Another one that says they're using an umbrella policy for liability. How do you actually pass the land to someone money-wise? So I think I already covered that one. I may have, oh yeah, I kind of already covered that one. There are a lot of different options, because once you have the money, you can decide if you want to put it in a trust, you want to pass it through a will, different things like that. Definitely talk to your accountant to figure out the best way to do that for yourself in terms of weighing to handle gifting taxes and estate or inheritance tax, because inheritance tax things will be changing potentially, because we don't know yet what the federal government is going to do once the current regulations change this year. In terms of the LLC structure, how best to keep ongoing successor participation interests when timber harvests are so infrequent? So one of the things that I recommend doing in terms of how to keep them interested is by involving them in understanding the process. Both my family's, or my husband's family and my family, has had woodlots. In my husband's family, his siblings have met with his dad. They know that it takes so many years that their property is set up to do a timber harvest. I believe it's about every 7 years. because of the way they're managing it and only taking trees of a certain size and a certain type each time they do a harvest. They are all brought into the situation, they know the process, and they're aware of it. On my family side, there was not that education and that training in terms of understanding how frequent you should do it and how, if we manage this correctly, this can be a long-term investment. And so not having that education brought on the lack of interest. So they harvested it a little too frequent and harvested a lot smaller than what really needed harvested. And so now, in order for another year's or next harvest, it's going to be quite a long time because we didn't manage it properly. And so by not letting them get invested and understanding the process and how patience gets you more of an income, because we're able to extend that income later on in life, has led to a lack of interest. So I think if you do some education along the way so that they understand that essentially that sweat equity of managing it and being patient and everything will pay off in the long run, that will help keep their interest. And I see Veronica nodding, so I'm assuming she's going for my answers on some of these questions. Let's see, Veronica mentioned that we have a survey link, and it'd be great if you could fill that out to provide us some feedback, because this is our first round of doing these, and we really want to make sure we're answering your questions and we're hitting some goals for us to know these programs are worthwhile. All right, the next question. If the land is worth much more to a developer to the successor, is there a compelling option for those who want to leave the land to some entity that keeps it a woods? So in some cases, the incumbent generation is worried about successors taking the land out of a woodlot and selling it for housing, per se, or maybe selling it for urban sprawl. And so there are individuals who do decide that instead of doing that, they're going to make plans not to leave their woodlot to their successor, but maybe to a land trust. And those are options. We actually have some woodlots that have been given to Purdue to manage for forest education and research and different things. And so there are options. If that is something you're interested in, I would talk maybe to your district forester. I think Liz is very knowledgeable about some of those options as far as who is looking for land. So there are individuals out there that can tell you, but talking to a land trust and just finding out more about it could be something, and just deciding if that is the right option for you, in terms of what you would like to see the future hold. A lot of really good questions tonight, and I'm hoping that I'm answering them the best that I can. And again, if you don't have more questions that you don't want to put in chat, but you think of them tomorrow, you're more than welcome to email Veronica or I. Again, Veronica, believe you said you're in Franklin County, and I'm in Putnam County, so you're always welcome to just Google Jenna Neese or Veronica Bullock in our counties, and you'll find us, and we can answer questions. Or send them to Liz, and Liz will send them up to us. Okay, got another one. It seems it would be easier to have the landowner divide land without input from family members. Family would not what they inherit until my death. So there are individuals who decide how they're going to pass down the land without talking to the family. And it is doable to pass on the land or the business without talking to everyone. The thing that sometimes happens when there's no communication and that incumbent makes some decisions on what they're going to do and don't share that with anyone, it can lead to a lot of hurt feelings, and it can lead to destruction of the family. Because let's say in the case of my family, my mom and her siblings all think that the land's going to be split equally between all of them. So again, that 33%. But if my grandma decides, nope, I'm going to give 50% to this daughter because she lives here, 50% to this daughter, and my son's not getting nothing, it could lead to the fact that my uncle may choose that when he finds that out after my grandmother has passed, that he wants nothing to do with his siblings. Now, that's not the case, and we don't want that to happen. My uncle and my mom and my aunt are all aware of the plans, but if that would happen and they're caught off guard, it can lead to a lot of hurt feelings. And we don't want families to break up over this, because we really want them to have open dynamics and open communication and let them keep continued connections for the rest of their lives, so that there's always that build up and they're always together and they're able to have holidays and things. And so we don't want anyone to be blindsided. Likewise, you don't want someone to think they're going to get an inheritance and then they don't receive it and they're blindsided and they've expected it so long that they had already spent some money and now they're not able to pay their bills. So just having some discussions ahead of time can avoid some, disastrous situations later on. Because sometimes with those disasters form, not only is it hurt family discussion, they can turn into legal battles that end up costing even more money for the family because they've got to hire attorneys and go before a judge to make sure that what their family member, the incumbent, decided is really what's followed.
But just to echo that, hopefully it's working clear. I guess.
Okay, so go ahead, Veronica.
Yeah, I put our email in the chat, and so linked a few of the resources that we referenced in this presentation. So one of the links is to our Purdue Succession planning website. So there's a lot of resources on that page. And then also I put in a link to a Kansas State Extension resource for communication and family dynamics that we used. So you could really spend a lot of time reading about and learning more about succession planning. And say Jenna and I are happy to answer questions. If you have specific questions too, you can always reach out to us individually. And say if anyone else has anything they want to unmute themselves and ask, we're happy to answer those now too.
I just had one follow-up about that land trust possibility. If this property is already going to like the successor generation soon, and so it's going to get divided in terms of people's interest, percent interest in it. And if they have different ideas, do they have to go with like that one person who says, no, we're selling it and turning it into money? Or can like some of them say, oh, I want to give my portion to land trust, and then like how small of a portion would a land trust ever be interested in? An acre.
So I really don't know how small of a portion of land trusts would be interested in, but what I can tell you is that on the farming side of things, there are things such as buy-sell agreements that can be put in place. So it would be like an agreement saying that if one of the successors wants to sell, they have to give first right to X, Y, and Z other members of the family to buy it before they can just sell it to a developer or someone else. So I would recommend talking to an attorney if there are ways to put things in place so that no one member can force a sell on others. Because I know that is available in the farming world. So I would think that there is a way to make that work for a woodlot or a forest so that the family, one person can't force it upon everyone else.
Okay.
We have 36 acres wood. I only found one land trust organization interested, and that was mostly because they have other holdings in the general area where we are. And so there's not a ton of them, but there may be options.
Mm-hmm. And there's somebody who can connect you to the different ones, and then you just cold call them all or something like that?
You can cold call them, but I mean, you might reach out to Liz and she may have some suggestions too. as far as land trust in the state of Indiana. You could possibly talk to a district forester about different options too.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
We're not seeing any other questions come in. Looks like there's, oh, okay, that's me clicking. If you have any other questions, again, feel free to reach out to us. We really appreciate you all joining us tonight, for your time and investing in this topic. So thank you for being attentive, for asking great questions. Please feel free to reach out to us. And remember, next week, session 4 will be the final session of this Succession Woodland Owner Series. If you don't mind filling out the survey for us, it'd be really helpful. Like Jenna said, this is the first time we've done kind of this woodland succession owner planning spin on this program. We do several succession plannings, but they've been more targeted at farm families. So we'd really be interested to hear your feedback with this woodland forest kind of spin for succession planning. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it. If you're going to watch basketball, enjoy the game. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good
Thank you.
night. See you guys.